Okay, Jean, today we're going to talk about Peru, which is, not a big country, but very interesting, mainly because of the China influence and the massive port that was built. I mean, it's one of the biggest ports, I think, in Latin America, including Brazil,
Yep.
and plans to build this highway east to west connecting connect through the Amazon. I mean, it's a wild thing, but it's an interesting little country, but mainly because of commodities. Right?
Yeah, it's all about commodities, and it's all about the most scarce of all commodities today, copper. So yeah, and also it's a big silver producing country, and silver once again is has appreciated a lot, and they have very very high silver reserves. They're a traditional producer, and then there's all that copper, and then it's an economy that's it's done pretty well by Latin American standards. It's really been quite good. Despite all the political instability, the economy just chugs along, and the stock market's been good. So yeah, and as you said, they're right at the middle of the crossfire here in all the U.S.-China relations. And honestly, I'm really interested to see what Jose has to say about that. So that's
Hey, Jose.
Hey Tom, how are you?
I'm good. You remember
hi
Jean?
Jose.
Hi
Pleasure.
John, long time no see.
Yep.
All right,
Yeah.
Jose. Listen, thank you very much. What I normally do is I'll give a bio.
hmm
I know you very well, but I think it'd be good to just to give you some perspective. So let's start with Jose Gonzales. Thanks for coming on. You are the managing partner of it's a boutique investment bank focused on the Andean region, specializing in commodity infrastructure. You were direct Life Invest, an asset management company based in the U.S. and Panama. But your career is very interesting. You started very in the early days of emerging markets in your finance career with Baring Securities, maybe really the first boutique dedicated emerging market investment bank. You were there and strategist. This was a pioneer in researching and trading of developing country equities and debt. After Baring, she worked with me, obviously, at Credit Lyonnais, which became Credit Agricole, one of the biggest banks in Europe, as a strategist, and then transitioning to investment banking, which is what you're doing today. Academically, you're the former chair of Latin American Studies at Columbia University and a founder of the Columbia's Caribbean Studies Center. You also have a master's at Columbia as well in Latin American Studies. You've lived all over Latin America, primarily in Peru, Venezuela, Colombia. Obviously, you're based in the U.S. today. So let's get started with an easy question. Let's talk about Peruvian politics. There's an election coming this year, but Peru is so important. We were just talking about the importance of what's going on in China and U.S. But let's start with the political situation today and how you see that evolving into April of 2026, and go from there.
Yeah, I mean Peru has been politically volatile to say the least. I mean, we have 8 presidents in 10 years, and just 3 in this last election period, which in Peru lasts for 5 years. The president of Peru, Dina Boluarte, who replaced Pedro Castillo, who lasted in the presidency slightly more than a year after he intended to do a soft coup and then was vacated and now it's in jail waiting for trial. President Boluarte was expected to finish the period against all odds when she took power when Castillo was ousted. And in a move that nobody expected, she was ousted on turn. And now we have the former president of Congress, Jose Geri, who should finish. And I said should because nobody can confirm that he would not be vacated in turn. He should last until July next year. This volatility started with the back when Pedro Pablo Kuczynski was vacated back in the day, and from then on, it's been nonstop. And curiously enough, compared to other countries in Latin America, these political volatility, which reflects Peru is a country that is progressing a lot. I mean, when we started, when I was working in Barron Securities back in 1990, we started work in Mexico, then Argentina. I opened Argentina with Eduardo Tapia, and my third country was Peru back in 1991. And at the time, Peru's GDP was $26 billion. International reserves were negative $400 million after the government of Alan Garcia, his first administration, in which inflation amounted to $2.2 million, 2.2 million% after 5 years. Nowadays, Peru's GDP on the first semester, the first half of this year, have reached $300 billion. And international reserves are at the level of $85 billion. I mean, compared to 73 billion when Pedro Castillo assumed the presidency a few years ago. So there's been a lot of progress, but progress is usually tumultuous. And in Peru has been particularly tumultuous on this political front. What has happened? What has happened politically? I mean, in these more or less 30 plus years, we have incorporated a lot of the base of the income population into the economy. That's what the economy has grown. Now Peru has a number of billionaires and large fortunes and large corporations that didn't exist in the past. And technology through basically las redes, the social networks and technology through cell phone has incorporated people culturally into the life of the nation. And that insurgency of a new consumer class, a new nation, a transforming nation, has made this political tumult to take place, and doesn't seem to be settled. We have elections next April, a new administration next July, and there's no clear leadership in the country, no political parties, and there's a new regional governments that probably will shape the political profile of Peru. In the meantime, the economy keeps doing very well. And that's what, when you see Boluarte gets kicked out of office and the bonds don't move much, 11 basis points, the foreign exchange, the sol devalues by 2 soles. Credit default swaps don't increase substantially. The balance of payments of Peru is really solid, really strong. There's a lot of solvency. And the next challenge for what to do with that solvency going forwards.
Jose, how do you explain so much political turbulence? With all these people, all these presidents being kicked out, but socially, it seems the situation is calmer. So we don't have the street uprisings that Chile that have been so detrimental for Chile, Argentina. How is Peru? If I'm correct, correct me if I'm wrong, but how is Peru able to maintain the streets calmer?
I mean, the first government of Alan Garcia, which created this financial catastrophe, sort of develop a trauma among Peruvians. That's why we are so focused in solvency and in keeping the economy stable. The Constitution of 1993 did something very peculiar, which is in Peru, private contracts are senior to the interest of the government. The government is subsidiary. The public sector is subsidiary to the private sector. I mean, I don't think not even the Swiss have that kind of constitutional article. So first there was this focus on the private sector and wealth. And Peru has been traditionally a very conservative country in general compared to other countries in Latin America, say Chile or even Argentina with Peronismo, or Cuba, obviously, or Venezuela. And on the other hand, those 5 years of Alan Garcia, 85 to 90, coincided with the resurgence of the Shining Path in Peru, which started in 1980 and lasted for 13 years until Abimael Guzman, its leader, was captured in Peru in 1992. So that has created also a sense that in Peru, there's no much space for radical options, neither for violence. People are they reject that kind of movements. I mean, we have to remember that we have a president that lasted for slightly more than a week. I think it was 8 days, Merino, when President Vizcarra, who was the president of Pedro Pablo Kuczynski, was ousted by Congress, and Merino fell because of social protest among younger people. And one of the reasons why President Boluarte has a very low popularity, 3%. The current president, Merino, Haiti, has 6% popularity, because it was also because there were protests in the provinces, particularly in Puno, and the army in repressing them killed like 60 people, and that was a mark in her. So that's what the conditions in Peru are, and it's stably unstable, unstably it's stable. And on the other front, there's a very dependent central bank that has kept the monetary policy as the cornerstone of this economic stability. So and there's as mostly in the rest of the world, particularly in Latin America, the whole political establishment has fragmented. We have all these small parties on Congress, and Congress has a strong power in terms of vacating the president, what they do every time there's a conflict. So that's the president in dissolving Congress, what Vizcarra did at the time. It's all a consequence of the reforms that Fujimori established in 1993. But people in Peru in general appreciate this stability, which nobody wants to change very much.
It's really interesting to me that this difference that we see in Peru. If you look around Latin America, Mexico, Brazil in particular, it's welfare distribution is really what drives everything, right? AMLO basically got reelected because the economy didn't grow, but people are happy with the redistribution. It seems very difficult. Like I look at Brazil, it's the same thing. Unless you offer more and more welfare to people, they don't vote for you. How does Peru avoid that?
I think, there's another element that it's precise to understand the Peruvian situation. 70% of the workforce are in the informal sector. So only 20% of the population work for the formal sector. And that 70%, there's when we used to go to Peru back in the day, we worked at Crea Leonel with Tom. That was back in 1993, 1994. I used to mention to Tom, you go to Peru, it's very disorganized. It feels more like Beijing, China at the time in which it was progressing fast, and it was kind of chaotic than any other countries in the region. And that its structure has created a lot of well-being. An economy growing basically 1,000% in terms of magnitude from 26 billion to 300 billion has created a lot of well-being. But it's kind of a wild country in a certain way, in the sense that it grows, it creates these benefits, but there's no articulation from the state. One of the things that the Fujimori Constitution dissolved back in 1993 was what it was called the Instituto Nacional de Planificación. There was this planning institution that more or less exists in any other country in Latin America. In Peru, it doesn't exist. There's progress, but we don't reach development. Income distribution is very skewed, even though it has progressed a lot. Wealth is very skewed. And these 20% of the population that is formal, which 13% it's basically very conservative, tend to elect presidents or want to elect presidents that keep the status quo. The problem with that status quo is it's starting to be dysfunctional. As any other places in Latin America, crime is increasing in the region, and crime always comes with progress. You go to Haiti, there's no crime. It's a gang nation, which is a sort of a different thing, like certain African nations. Extortion, illegal activities is increasing. There's a lot of violence in Peru these days, which is now part of the political agenda, and President Haiti is focusing on that. He's been called the Bukele of Peru. He's sort of trying to imitate Bukele. And now what is happening, the Fiscal Council, there's an institution in Peru which it's taking part, but different representative of the state just have a meeting this week saying that they're concerned about the pressure on the fiscal accounts. Having said that, the fiscal goal is 2.2%, and it's at 2.4%. Compared to other nations in Latin America or even the US, it's not bad. And talking to one of their members, I was saying, there's all of these initiatives in the legislature in Congress to increase a sort of a welfare state, but it's very chaotic, it's very disorganized, and there needs to be a certain guidance in terms of what legislation is going and how that solvency, I mean, in Peru, debt to GDP is only 30%. And there's a reluctance in terms of using those resources towards the benefits of the nation. So we pile up and pile up and pile up wealth, and it just keep increasing, increasing, increasing. And at some point, inflation is below 2%. Economy grows close to 3%. Latin American average, according to the IMF, should grow 2.2% this year. So it's not bad in terms of growth. We have 85 billion in international reserves. Consumption grows at 5%. Construction grows at 6%. At some point, those conditions, they kind of start being tricky. Inflation low, very strong FX. Peruvian sol is one of the strongest currencies in the world right now, particularly in Latin America. So people are starting to get squeezed in terms of feeling, the economy is doing great, but I'm not really improving. And the benefit for that 20%, 13% of the population doesn't necessarily spread to the 70% that, work more or less by their own. There could be a pressure of that in the sense that there's been every single president. I mean, since Fujimori has been very conservative when it comes to the financial situation. But now that the situation is changing in terms of, of all this wealth being created, that might change. I mean, there's a concern that there will be a decline in the financial conditions of Peru. Having said that, I was mentioning in an interview I gave a few days ago when Jairi took over the presidency, it took Chavez and Maduro 19 years to destroy Venezuela's economy. Since 1998, when Chavez was elected, since 2017, when they defaulted on the debt, it was a long process with a lot of volatility in the middle. And the conditions in Peru are only going to get better and better. We have 20% of copper reserves, of global copper reserves. Copper is trading close to $5 a pound, which is still a very good number. We're an important producer of gold, which, has gone up and up and up. And now I think JP Morgan says it could reach $6,000 an ounce in the next 2 years. So the economy, it doesn't seem to give any indication that it's going to change. As Tom was saying, there's significant Chinese investment in the region. There's interest of the Western world in Peru's mineral resources. Chevron just bought 35% with Anadarko. Anadarko, is it? Yeah. Which is Occidental, if I'm not mistaken, in oil fields in Peruvian shores. There's a potential that Peru it produces now 40,000 barrels a day. It can produce, if Chevron is successful in improving the potential of those three blocks, it can produce between 250 and 400,000 barrels a day. Ecuador produces 470, Colombia 700. So it's very well aligned to keep doing well. And the challenge going forward is, what do you do with that solvency, with that wealth, so this turmoil doesn't keep being there? We need to think longer term in Peru these days.
Jose, you touched on obviously China, and that's something that's very important. So this port this massive port that's just been built, Chancay. I don't think anyone really understands how big this thing is, the importance of this port. The Chinese, I think, own 60% through one of the government agencies. Can you talk a little about that? How what the magnitude of that port, and what is the Chinese influence, not only just in the economy, but if there's any influence in politics?
When we were working in Venezuela back in Chavez's second administration, it was around 2005, 2006, we developed a very close relationship with Bank of China. Bank of China was looking into Venezuela because the Chinese government, the country at the time, was very focused on the potential of Venezuela for China. And they told us in one of those meetings, they told us two things that stick to my mind. They say the business Chinese cycle is 30 years compared to the Western business cycle is 10 years, which sort of makes sense. And second, they say for us, the future of China, of trade in China is what is called now the Global South, which was not called the Global South by then, because he said the U.S. is maturing, it's consumption in the US is going to decline. We have to look for the demographic bonus, and we believe that's in South America. So they're very focused at the time. And back in the day, there was Puerto del Callao, the Callao port in Lima, which is surrounded by the city, could not grow more, and it was privatized. When it was privatized, it was pretty obvious that this port needed a secondary port that would assist it. I mean, since it's in the middle of, it's in the border in the ocean, but the city surrounds it, there was no more way to grow it, and logistically it was becoming a problem. So there's this group of former Navy officers and developers that identify Chancay as a very good secondary port, very close to Lima, not a big distance, and with a very good geographical conditions, especially to the depth of the natural waters that were ideal for a port. First, they went to the States looking for investors. Nobody was interested. Then went to Europe. Nobody was interested. And they went to China and they found the investors in China. So it was a syndicate of Chinese banks and Chinese firms that invested in this port that just opened last year, if I'm not mistaken. Now it's starting with just one pier, but I believe it's going to have 6 piers at the end of the day. It can even grow larger. And the Chinese consider that 50% of the trade between China and Latin America, not Peru, the whole of Latin America would go through that port. It will be like they call a mother port. I mean, from that port with Panamax plus, I mean, ships that cannot go through the canal, they will be redistributed all the loads. And it's not a coincidence that the main viceroyalty of Spain was established in Peru and in El Callao. It's just in the middle of the southern Pacific of Latin America. It has natural conditions, geographic conditions to build a port that would service large ships. And now there is a project that is being started to discuss between China and Brazil. Brazil has become a major supplier of oil to China. China is diversifying its sources of oil, and Brazil is one of the focus of attention to build a railroad that go from the coast of northern Brazil across Brazil and would end up in the port of Chancay, which makes a lot of sense. There's already a highway that was built between Manaus and the coast of Peru because it makes more sense to ship the Brazilian soy to China through Peru than just go all the way through Brazil and all the way around the world into China. One of the reasons President Toledo is in jail because Odebrecht built that highway and he got $30 million in kickbacks for the contracts. But the road exists. And there's not only the conditions in Chancay, there's the Puerto de Hilo in southern Peru, close to southern copper operations in production and refining of copper. Southern is owned by Grupo Mexico from Mexico. Is one of the largest copper producers in the world. So it's not only going to be Chancay and El Callao, it's going to be Hilo. And there's a project there's a port in Arequipa, where I was born. It's called Matarani. There's another project in Corio, which has been offered to the Americans to compensate for the Chinese influence that could make Peru a major power for, especially when projections for copper is for prices to keep stable to increasing because of energy transition, electromobility, digitalization of the economy, in which copper prices there's gonna be a deficit between 80 and 30% in copper supply and demand going forwards. Also, China has investment in mining, substantial investment in mining. Peru has all kinds of investment, Australian, American, almost everybody who's somebody in mining is already in Peru. China doesn't dominate mining, but has investments in mining. And the most interesting thing, now China is one of the largest producers of electricity and distributors of electricity in Peru. They bought 2, if I'm not mistaken, of the main producers, and they own the largest distribution network of electricity in the world. Obviously, the Chinese goals are on the longer term. According to Xi Jinping, Puerto de Chancay, the Chancay port was the last hito, the last goal in the new the Road and Belt Initiative, and the next step is to invest in what they call critical markets. And Peru seems to be one. One of the projects they have is to build an assembly of Chinese electric vehicles around the port of Chancay. I mean, we buy in the world 90 million units a year. China produces like 20. It can produce like 40. And it's able to produce electric vehicles of they're not much of good quality yet, but they might be at a cost of $5,000 to $8,000, which would give them a huge projection in the Latin American markets.
Jose, as you well know, President Trump has decided to return to the Monroe Doctrine, which I guess we now call the Donroe Doctrine. And the whole world has changed really over the past 9 months. I think we're clearly in a new world order, the Trumpian order. Where does Peru fit into this? Where does Peru fit into Trump's vision, and how do you deal with that?
Curiously enough, I mean, Trump has paid a lot of attention to Argentina, or attention to Argentina, just say, Venezuela, obviously, Colombia, Brazil, I mean, with their tariffs and Bolsonaro, now in Nicaragua with the tariffs and Ortega. He likes Bukele. He has met with Bukele at the White House. El Salvador is a tiny country, And in this Armada in the Caribbean, they just announced that they're sending an aircraft to the Caribbean and in the Pacific, and the Secretary of War Hegseth just also announced that a 6th ship has been bombed with casualties involved. He hasn't paid attention to Peru. He hasn't mentioned Peru. Somehow Peru it's off the radar of President Trump. And there's an analyst in Peru that is called Augusto Alvarez Rodriguez that they say that Peru should assume the strategy when you go through the X-rays in the airports, don't breathe, don't move, just keep quiet, don't make much fuss, and maybe nothing would happen. With President Trump, you never know, isn't it? I mean, he can do whatever comes to him. And the copper tariffs he was going to impose, or the market fear that will be imposed to concentrates and cathodes, didn't came to be at the end of the day. So Peru was not affected, but it's pretty obvious. Mining.com, the Northern Miner publishing group, says that we cannot talk of zones of influence anymore, but zones of control when it comes to critical minerals. And obviously, Latin America comes with the control zone of the U.S., while China has invested heavily in Africa to control those resources. 40% of copper production and reserves are in Latin America between Chile and Peru. Argentina has copper potential. So does Ecuador and Panama, which the mine of First Quantum being reopened probably next year. So at some point, President Trump, I mean, he's not even a year in office, might pay attention to this. The Chancay port has not been mentioned. We don't believe was part of the discussions between Xi and President Trump. We don't believe they're going to discuss that in Seoul next week. But it was a point of discussion between former President Biden and Xi in San Francisco. And it was supposed to be a continuation of that discussion in Lima, but by the time Biden had Kamala Harris lost the election. So the Xi-Biden meeting in Lima last November was more, protocolar than in any agreements. But what we understand, there was a meeting in San Francisco. There was a discussion about energy and critical minerals that is going to be continued in Peru on the following year, in which, is what Biden proposed to Xi. I mean, competition without conflict, and then Xi answered him a few months later saying that there's enough space in this world for hegemony, for that double hegemony between China and the United States, but that didn't come to be. So far, it seems that the administration Trump is not focused in Peru. But again, with all of these Chinese interests and all these tensions with China and all the potential that China has, Chevron now is in Peru, interestingly enough, investing $105 million to drill to drill oil fields in the coast of Peru to see if they can reach 250 to 400,000 barrels. But it's back in Venezuela with a license that everybody assumed existed, but nobody has seen. And the question everybody is, why is Chevron interested in Venezuela? It's only 250,000 barrels. Well, 250,000 barrels, Chevron produces 3 million barrels a day. Half of that comes from the Permian. There is geological indications that the Permian might dry in the next 10 to 15 years. And it's getting lighter and lighter crude. So Venezuela can produce. It's the largest oil reserve of conventional oil, not fracking oil, as in Argentina in Vaca Muerta. It's the largest reserves in the Western world. Venezuela can produce geologically up to 5 to 6 million barrels. And so if Chevron were to lose half of its production because of the Permian in the next, say, 15 years, Venezuela, it's important. And 250,000 barrels a day is 8% of Chevron's daily production. And we asked them at some point, why are they investing in Peru? Because for the same reason, 250, 400,000 barrels ended up being significant for Chevron, and they diversifying risk in a country that is more stable than Venezuela. So all of that might or not have an impact in what the Trump administration wants to do in Peru. But again, to this moment, I mean, he doesn't even mention it. It doesn't seem to exist for them so far.
So you think for the time being, at least, laying low could make Peru a winner in this new global order?
Yes, I mean, we produce, between Chile and Peru, we produce 40% of global copper. I mean, the problem is that China refines 40% of all copper in the world. I mean, the thing is, how do you cannot move the mines, but you can move the refining capacity. Grupo Mexico is increasing the refining capacity of Filo refinery substantially at a large cost. And they just get approval for their new mine in Arequipa, in Tia Maria. And Peru is also very important in terms of agribusiness. We export like $3 billion a year. It doesn't seem to be much. The potential is up to 10 billion. 64% of exports come from mining, and mostly copper. That's where the robust trade balance of Peru comes from. It's mining and mostly copper. And a substantial amount of that exports comes to the United States. Grapes, blackberries, avocados, asparagus. The difference, mining is capital intensive. It's not labor intensive. Agribusiness is labor intensive. It's very important for the working population inside of the country. Gold is important. The problem with gold now, illegal gold in Peru produces as much as legal gold. And there's all kinds of mafia crime structures around gold, which has become more important in Peru than the drug business. On the first hand, it generates more money. On the second hand, if you get caught with, kilos of cocaine, you go to jail for 30 years. If you get caught by kilos of gold, which is it's seized, and then you don't go to jail. So there's that. The good news is the bad news. Well, how do you address the crime situation? I was invited to give a speech in Colombia last year about crime in Latin America. I did my PhD studies. I didn't finish at Berkeley in sociology and social pathology is what I studied, and said at some point crime is beyond the criminal part of it. It becomes a social response to income distribution problems, which has political effects. So in order to understand how to deal with crime, you have to go back to the early 20th century and how the US did it. And you have to go to Japan. I was invited to give a series of talks in Tokyo. And very interesting to see that for the Japanese, the Yakuza, it's part of the social order. There's an understanding between the police and the Yakuza as long as certain rules are respected. Not that in the US doesn't exist, but it's pretty obvious in Japan, and doesn't seem to, force anybody to rip their clothes when it comes to organize society. That's thing. It's a new mentality. I mean, the Bukele method works in El Salvador. It's a small country, but he has put in jail more than 50,000 young people between 17 and 24. So youth unemployment due to these in El Salvador is 7%. He's creating a problem in itself that it's going to be difficult to address. We extrapolated numbers in Brazil, and if a Brazilian president would do the same as Bukele, it would imply that you have to put in jail 3 million young people, which, there's no space for 3 million people in any jail, and you're creating more problems. So that's part of what is coming. And somehow Trump is becoming ideological about these. It's very Bukelean, isn't it? The way he's addressing the drug problem in the Caribbean and the Pacific, Colombia and Venezuela, when our problem is fentanyl coming from Mexico with Chinese uh, raw materials rather than cocaine. And cocaine goes through Ecuador now, most of it. I mean, that's the point of distribution these days. That's why Ecuador is becoming so violent. The president of Ecuador just announced that they tried to poison him with marmalade they give in one of its tours in the country.
So far, Trump has not increased the tariffs on Peru.
No, I mean, we are in the lower end of the 10%, which seemed to become 15%. It's sort of the flat tariff. The balance, the trade balance is favorable to the US. So we shouldn't fall into that. But Trump tariffs, as we've seen, they don't seem to have much of a logic. So we shouldn't get tariffs, but we do, and they're affecting margins. I mean, in today's inflation numbers, we're starting to see the tariffs crippling into prices. So at some point, the importers have to assess if you keep importing grapes and asparagus and avocados and jalapenos. Peru produces a significant amount of jalapenos. There's enough jalapenos in Mexico for demand, and blackberries. If the consumer in the US is going to, keep paying premium prices for premium agricultural goods, at some point, the problem is not if you're going to pay more for grapes, is that if you pay more for everything and you're going to buy imported grapes.
Jose, what if anything does China have from a standpoint of political influence? Are they trying to, or they're just taking sort of a very passive role in the whole Peruvian political sphere?
They're very, I mean, they sort of have a relationship. They have a relationship. They've been very good at managing the political volatility, but it's not pretty obvious. The Chinese ambassador is not a personality in Peru. In Panama, it was for different reasons. I get the ports, and then prior to this discussion of the Hong Kong concerns in the ports in the canal, but one of the things Margaret Mayer is the probably one of the most knowledgeable persons in Chinese Latin America relationships with the inter-American dialogue, said that what China has done, not only in Peru, but in the rest of Latin America, is develop very strong relationships at the municipal level. So somehow China is working on a longer term perspective based on what Bank of China told us in Venezuela at the time than what the US has traditionally done. I think they are cultivating relationships that would pay in time. And the thing is, where is the political renewal is going to come in Peru? From Peru, during the Toledo administration, the Peru created regions. And that process has been kind of chaotic, but the new leaders are the governors of these new regions. That's what probably the new leadership is going to come for the last 3 elections. It used to be in Peru that Lima elected the president. I mean, Lima has a third of the population of the country. And it will always be who wins in Lima wins in the country. For the last 3 elections, it hasn't worked that way, or 2 or 3 elections. Now, the interior of the country is electing the president. And that's what this new leadership is starting to be formed. I mean, I used to tell my fellow Peruvians, Castillo is the first step. It's the beginning of a very important transformation. Now the people are going to elect their own leaders, and they might be incompetent, but let's define what incompetent means. It's that you lack competence in certain things, but they're competent in other fronts. And all the processes, this is what Farid Zakaria writes in The Age of Revolutions. We're going through a major revolution, major social and political changes. Is why is Trump so strong politically? Because his base, that 30% of mostly wild male with no college education, which were displaced by globalization and liberalism, the way it went from Clinton to today, are reclaiming their space in society, and that generates political change. Extrapolate that to Peru, and it's these mass of people that now are consuming and making the wealthy wealthier. You see some buildings now in Peru that you wouldn't imagine in Lima 20 years ago. I mean, $3 to $7 million apartments that people buy and can buy to live in Peru. That is changing, and there's fear between these conservative sectors in understanding, that the country has changed for good, and it's not gonna revert. Are we gonna have a Bolivian effect in which, 20 years after mass domination, the Democracia Cristiana, the Christian Democrats are taking over the country? And again, it's not the Tuto Quiroga who won the election, very liberal, very conservative. It's sort of middle center in Bolivia. So that might happen, but it would take, we'll see what happens in Chilean elections, see what happens in Venezuela eventually. I mean, the Nobel Peace Prize to Maria Corina Machado is very symbolic in that sense. The Academy is always very wicked when they give that prize every year. But in Peru, the process seems to be the opposite. It's more representative of the majorities that are going to be in power for the next few years. And I think what the establishment in Peru has to understand, that the current conditions favors a minority that can go shopping to Miami or vacation to Madrid. No inflation, strong foreign exchange. If you earn, say, 5,000 to whatever $1,000 a month in Peru, you're extremely well. But if you're in the informal sector and you live in soles, you're getting tighter and tighter and tighter. That is what, and you have piled up all of this solvency, and that's what needs to change. And again, there's nothing indicates that, given the conditions of mining, oil, fishing, and the agribusiness things, and in Chinese investment, mining investment this year was supposed to be poor for mining. It's been extraordinary, and nothing indicates that next year will not be. With $5 to $6 a pound for copper, investment is going to keep coming, and production is going to keep coming. The world needs copper in massive quantities that very few countries in the world can supply.
Jose, I would love your views on Peru's neighbors, Chile, Argentina, Brazil. How do you see those countries from an investment point of view?
I mean, Argentina, it was a darling until it wasn't. I mean, Argentina is crazy, John. You and Tom know Argentina very well. I mean, I opened Argentina back in the day. It was the second market I did at Barring Securities after Mexico. And when we came after hyperinflation, particularly in Brazil, Peru, and Argentina, what was the anchor against hyperinflation? In Brazil, it was fiscal. You remember the Fomiciro against the IMF primary fiscal deficit, which would guarantee that debt will be served. In Peru, it's monetary. Peru dollarized, and it's been a struggle to recover control of the monetary base, making it more in soles than in dollars. So it was in Peru is monetary. The monetary base would not grow beyond a certain point in which international reserves increase, which was very successful, the same as in Brazil. In Argentina, it was FX, the convertibilidad of Caballo, which lasted too long and then broke with De la Rua. And De la Rua tried, once convertibility fall, they tried to impose it again. And what did Milei does? He uses FX as an anchor against inflation. And it doesn't work because it cannot generate enough FX on their own, for it to turn around. And guess what? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, I was looking at the numbers. Argentina's international reserves is $2.2 billion. I mean, and this lifeline that the Treasury has given them in this swap of $20 billion, which it's not enough. I mean, and at some point he lost the province of Buenos Aires. We'll see what happens in the regional elections that are coming. But Milei seems to be politically deaf. And Peronismo, it's integral part of Argentine culture. It's something you have to learn to live with. And even though a lot of people hated the Kirchner, a lot of people loved him. Same thing with AMLO. Isn't it? AMLO left the presidency with 60-70% popularity, which these days in Latin America is huge. And Sheinbaum has inherited that. And AMLO was very populist, as you say, John. But on the same time, he was very pragmatic when it came to the economy. And Milei might have reached a point in which Argentina goes back, to being a mess again, and they don't seem to address the structural problems of the finances of the country to sort of solve it. And the IMF has to support them because they have no other option. They have their balance sheet of loans invested in Argentina. Chile, Boric, as Chile is always very organized, very stable. Boric was a radical. We see how Mandani does in New York City if he wins the election next week or the week after. November 4th, we have Tom and I are New Yorkers, in exile in North Carolina. But we'll see what happens in New York City. It's interesting. New York City becomes very interesting because there's reactions to the Trump presidency in Washington. And I think Chile might turn to a conservative. The both constitutional efforts failed. I mean, failed when the conservatives tried to do it, failed when the radicals tried to do it. It's like Chile doesn't want to change its ways. Very stable. I think that is the ideal for Latin America at this point is Uruguay, isn't it? I mean, there's Latin America and then there's Uruguay, which seems to be Switzerland in Latin America. And there's Chile. Chile, there's a lot of continuity. Things aren't going to change. It's still very much dependent on copper. It tries to be relevant, but probably it is going to start losing relevance. Peru, it's getting closer to Chile's GDP. If I'm not mistaken, Chile's GDP is 400 billion, Peru is 300, and Peru has conditions to be a larger, more dynamic economy than Chile. And if all the trade with Asia focus in Peru, Chile is going to be left to a certain degree on certain margins. It's not going to be relevant, but it's going to have its own dimensions. And very stable. And the market's very stable. The problem in Peru, and we always seen that with Tom, is no matter how the conditions get better, investable assets in Peru are still very limited. I mean, it's a market that doesn't have depth, but that's a problem in Latin America in general. And you can invest through larger corporations listed in the New York Stock Exchange through ADRs or not, or large corporations that do have investments in Peru, but the markets still are not there. There's new phenomena. The retail market is growing in Peru, but still small compared to the the size of the economy.
Brazil has any chance of breaking out of its mediocrity?
I mean, Lula is going to run for a fourth time. So, I mean, is it going to, continue this mediocrity? Brazil has always been disappointing politically. At some point, we in Latin America expected them to be a beacon of leadership. I mean, Mexico it's North America. It's too close to the US and bet its future into NAFTA at the time. And it sort of makes a lot of sense, and now the nearshoring is still, it's still a dynamic force in what Mexico should become. But Brazil has always been disappointing. Having said that, I mean, both Brazil and Mexico are becoming substantial economies. I mean, above $1 trillion in GDP, getting closer and closer to a certain degree to the size of the Russian economy, which Obama used to say the gas station with nuclear bombs. They're going to become more relevant. And what has created stability in Brazil and Mexico is it's the large size of its multinationals. I mean, that is undeniable. And at some point, I think the Brazilian corporate sector, even if they plan it or not, went the right way. I mean, the only way to compensate for political volatility was a substantial corporate sector that cannot be touched. I mean, at this point, you cannot nationalize companies in Brazil or Mexico because they're multinationals. I mean, you will run into problems with the world, with the court, the arbitration, and international arbitration. It would not really affect their businesses. I mean, the consolidation of the global beer market through Brazilian, Mexican, Colombian companies has been very interesting. I mean, the size of certain corporations in Mexico and their global influence or their influence in the U.S. markets is very substantial. But yet, as you said, John, it's very mediocre in a certain way. I mean, why are we not Koreans? Well, because we're not Koreans. I mean, I was just in Japan, and the Japanese case is very interesting. I was invited by, there was a group of cooperatives, Latin American cooperatives, so savings and loans, visiting Japan and visiting the cooperative banks in Japan, and they wanted me to explain them how the system works in Japan. I said, Japan is a very interesting country. It's the third size of Peru, but it has 126 million people. they're gonna lose 50 million people in the next 20 years. They have the largest proportion of aging population in the world, and the maternal reposition is very low, 1.3. It's not the lowest in the world, but it's one of the lowest. They're gonna need to import 60 million workers in the next 20 years. But Japan is, how does Japan work? It doesn't grow. It has no inflation. It has an aging population. It has the largest degree of debt to GDP in the world, almost 300%. It has a very strong base of domestic savings. We had a long seminar, a full day seminar with one of the banks, the cooperative banks in Japan, and say, what's the active lending rate in Japan? 1%. You know what's the passive? 0.5%. I mean, you get a mortgage at 1% for 30 years. So banking, it's not a good business anymore in Japan. So that's why they export capital. I think Buffett realized that as we started investing in Japan, there's something here that is interesting. But I told him, you know how many people in Japan belongs to a cooperative? 83% of the population. It's an economy that works in such peculiar ways. 50% of the agricultural production is generated by cooperatives. 30% of the population belongs to consumer cooperative. It's 96, 97% Japanese of origin. It is very, it's its assets and its liability. But there's something in Japan to learn. There's this Japanese philosopher, Saito, is Saito-san, if I'm not mistaken. He published an academic book in 2022, which became a success. A bestseller in Japan. Is called the Degrowth Manifesto. He said that we have to stop growing, and that any corporation in the future that doesn't become a cooperative would not succeed. I mean, that's also what Zakaria reflects in the age of revolution. The future is going to be different. Things are changing.
Jose, what we have learned over the past 4 or 5 years is countries that don't grow lose any kind of geopolitical importance.
Yes.
And Japan and Europe they're just shadows of their former selves.
Mm-hmm.
And they're realizing that, unless you grow, you just get squashed by everybody.
Yeah. But the thing is,
that's not a good future for Japan, right? Which is, not very far away from China. And in some ways they continue historical enemies.
And the thing is, I think we're gonna have to. What Saito is thinking is not in years, but in decades. I mean, I tell in these presentations, this iPhone, it's only 14, 15 years old. It didn't exist before. Look at how much it has changed in less than 2 decades. I mean, how is the world going to look in 30, 40, 50, 70 years? I mean, and that's what Japan becomes, we're going to, as you said, Europe is becoming like Japan, and it's not going to change because it's demographics. The US, I mean, we are a massive growth force. We grow 2% and we're huge. So 2% seems to be low, but it's for a large economy. Japan cannot grow more than 3% eventually. So all of that, those dynamics are changing, and then there's discussion about the environment in which we have influenced 73% of the world's surface. What is that? What is gonna happen? So that suddenly Japan starts becoming, let's pay attention to these people and see what they're doing and how we're going to look like. The global south is going to keep growing, and eventually Africa is going to be, the future of humanity by the end of the century and the beginning of next century. So what is Africa going to look in the 20th century? Those are 60,000 feet views instead of 30,000. I understand what you mean. In the short term, we got to keep growing. But if you look at the IMF projections, we're not growing as much. Beyond the global south, India, Vietnam, but Trump's tariffs are creating uncertainty in terms of those rates of growth.
Jose, the growth you're talking about in Peru obviously is being driven by a lot of FDI.
Mm-hmm.
And you touched on the lack of investment opportunities, right, for the equities, debt, et cetera. And I mean, any country, including China, that has evolved has to have a thriving capital markets, right?
Right.
Now, there is something happening in Peru where Peru, Chile, and Colombia are combining their stock exchanges. I think they begin trading in January of 2026, called NUAM. But that's just the trading vehicle. At the end of the day, do you see are there entrepreneurs? Do you see the possibility of new companies evolving as we wrap things up? I mean, what is the force outside of the China FDI? Is there a force that's going to create more businesses, entrepreneurs, and move that economy beyond just depending, almost exclusively on China?
Yeah, as any other country in Latin America, there's an ecosystem in these young people that have gone back to Peru. Now, Peruvian students come to study in the US or go to Europe, Spain, Holland, and then go back to Peru. There's an ecosystem, but it's limited because of this informal sector, this 70% that, that doesn't go into the Peruvian fintechs were very important, very interesting. As you know, Inca created a fund to invest in Peruvian techs. And there's been phenomena like Rappi, Mercado Libre, XP Investimentos that have done really well for themselves in the case of Peru, but it's limited. I mean, the key in Peru is it's not to formalize the 70%. It's to work within the informal sector to make it, to articulate it. I mean, these 70% is not going to look like the 30. The solutions are going to grow within this. And people start saving and investing when first you grow, then you progress. I mean, growth is economic, progress is financial, developing is human. To develop, you have to invest in education, health, and infrastructure. And as the US is doing in rare earths, the state has to have a certain role because there are certain sectors that are not profitable. So the private sectors are not going to get involved in that. And progress is what is starting to happen. So you have to create, and that's something we discussed at the time, Tom. I mean, if you don't have a domestic market like in the US, and an ecosystem of investors that make that domestic market growth and brings the foreign investors, especially now we're more stable, but back in the 90s when we were emerging markets as such, the current account crises were always a threat, and that didn't allow you to grow. That's a Mexican tequila that we lived through, and now students read it in the books. That is starting to happen. I mean, the local brokers are growing. They're using technology to recruit small investors. That's what XP Investimentos. It started as a training platform for investors, wannabe investors, and ended up being one of the largest financial concerns in Latin America. That's what we tried to do in Venezuela with Econinvest, but then Chavez was in the way and sort of shut down capital markets in a country that had potential in terms of growing. Colombia's fixed income markets are huge. Equity markets, not that much. But if you look at how fixed income is traded in Colombia, it's very significant. And now that's what these cooperatives are important. And in Peru, we have the Cooperativa de Ahorro y Préstamo de Municipal de Arequipa. It's my hometown. It's a municipal savings and loan managed $1.5 billion. So it's sort of small, but it's important and it's growing. If you put all of them together, suddenly you have investable assets, but it's a matter of training them, guiding them, helping them, and allow the corporate sector to believe that these capital democratization have a place. And it's not only about the money, it's about the networks, it's about the relationships, it's about managing social conflict when it comes to mining. It makes a lot of sense. You have to see what happened. I just finished reading Andrew Sorkin's 1929, how a good thing becomes such a bad thing, and this whole collapse happened, and it took years and years to recover. But those are the lessons people are studying. And there's Calpa, which is the largest now broker dealer in Peru, get this alliance with this fintech, and suddenly they grow their investor base by the thousands. Small investors, young people that want to, my son which is now 26 and it's an architect. Since he was a kid, he was interested in investing, and he's been pretty wise. He invested in gold, he invested in cryptos. He's making money on his small portfolio. But I think and they're long-term solutions. I mean, you have the large established companies that are listed and they're invested, and you have a bond market that, it's not risky, but pays well enough. And we have to pay we are equity people originally, but I realized during my career that fixed income, it's very important, and it's larger and it's bigger, Might sound boring for equity people, but that's something you have to work on.
Jose, listen, man, this has been fantastic. It's a, as we always said, it's a small country, Peru, but it always punches above its weight, and seems like being below the radar screen right now. And in this environment is a very good positioning. And we want to thank you again for your time and appearing.
Thanks for your invitation. Always a pleasure to talk to you guys and see you.
It was a pleasure, Jose.
Have a
Yeah.
Talk to you soon.
Anytime. We come a long way.